To leave the courthouse, his remarks very similar to what we've heard during other appearances at the courthouse, and frankly, during appearances at some of the rallies he's been able to fit in around. I have to say, though, the demeanor grim and angry, and clearly the weight of this is upon him. And he said something so interesting, Hallie. He said the real verdict will come November 5th. And to a certain extent, he is right, because for those who were thinking that there might be some legal resolution that would affect whether or not Donald Trump will ever see the Oval Office again, this case is likely not it. As you just mentioned, you can be a convicted felon and run for president, and you can be a convicted felon and serve as president. So the real verdict in terms of the politics is November 5th. He also said, I just want to say, point of fact, that this was a Biden administration hit job on him. This is a state prosecution. The DA here, Alvin Bragg, is certainly no fan of Mr. Trump, so you can't say there's no politics in it. But this is not a federal Biden administration prosecution.
And in fact, President Biden has gone to notable lengths to distance himself from commenting or reacting to much of the day-to-day about the trial or about the specifics on the legal issues here. You know, you point out, and that caught my ear too, that the real verdict is in November, because that is going to be former President Trump's rallying cry for the months that we have until this election takes place, because he sees it as an effective way to rally people around him here. It is notable here that he is coming out. I think it's interesting that it was a fairly short statement. This is listen, having covered him in the White House for many years, he understands the power of a television camera upon him and how to react in front of that television camera. He didn't go on for 25 minutes, and he frankly could have in this instance. I just want to note one other thing, too, on this sentencing date, Savannah, as we talk about the politics piece. It is 4 days before the start of the Republican convention, when Donald Trump is expected to officially take the nomination for the Republican Party, and it is also almost certainly going to be right in the middle of an announcement of his vice presidential pick. He has suggested he would do that in early July, probably right before the convention. What a collision of the campaign and the legal problems that he faces.
Well, let me ask Danny a question on that, because let's just say the judge did give him jail time on July 11th. Would he be remanded right then and there to the state prison? And what does that mean in terms of the convention and the campaign?
Well, first of all, the issue of prison is an issue that the Secret Service has been very quiet about how they would handle actually incarcerating a former president and a presidential candidate. And I think that will factor into the judge's decision. I think in all likelihood, you're not looking at a sentence of imprisonment. We may have been over this, but it's Class E felony, nonviolent, age of the offender, no guns, no drugs, not likely to happen here. In most jurisdictions, for example, in federal, you get a turn-in date. You ask for a turn-in date. It actually helps you with your sentence. Here in New York, it's uncertain whether or not the judge would remand him right away. But the odds of him being imprisoned on this Class E felony, which is the lowest level felony for a nonviolent first-time offender of his age, very unlikely.
And Judge Merchan certainly knows that and has seemed to want to bend over backwards to say, I'm not treating this defendant any differently, although Laura Jarrett says his violations of the gag order would have landed probably any typical defendant in much more hot water.
Yes, and something else to consider, too, that his sentence will now actually affect, particularly with his federal cases, his 2 federal criminal cases, it will now affect his criminal history category. So sentencing in federal court, and I'm jumping the gun, assuming that there may be a conviction in his federal cases, is a function of the gravity of the offense and your criminal history category. Now he may have a criminal history.
But real quickly, for those who are just tuning in here, he has been found guilty now in this Manhattan, this New York State case. There are 3 other cases pending. One is a state case in Georgia. 2 are federal cases. One regarding efforts to subvert the election in 2020 and January 6th. The other having to do with holding on to classified documents. But generally speaking, it is not expected that any of those cases will proceed to trial before Election Day.
And more than that, there's a strong probability that if any of the 2 federal cases are still pending when he's inaugurated, they will disappear. Either he will appoint an attorney general who is favorable to him, that attorney general will dismiss the cases, and barring that, he may attempt a self-pardon, which may or may not work. We simply don't know.
And if Biden wins, they continue, but he's a private citizen. And we'll see where that leads.
Exactly.
Just a quick legal point. He is not a convicted felon until he's sentenced. Is that?
Technically, yes. Technically, once he is sentenced, he will be a felon. He is technically a felon now, but typically the end of the case, the trial court end of the case, is upon the sentence. Then you file your notice of appeal, and then you are considered a felon during the pendency of that appeal. There are some jurisdictions where, strangely, Massachusetts is one. While your case is on appeal, a very famous Aaron Hernandez, the wide receiver for the Patriots, died while his case was on appeal. And under Massachusetts law, that resulted in him not having a criminal history. That is the exception. That is not the norm.
As we talk about the other legal issues that the former president faces, it may be worth getting a gut check on the timing and the timeline here for those three cases, Savannah, that you've laid out. The next one that we're watching the most closely is that federal election interference case, because we are waiting for that critical decision from the Supreme Court at some point, probably by the end of next month, by the end of June, before their term ends, when they will decide on the former president's claim of immunity in that case. There's the Florida federal case on the classified documents that were taken to Mar-a-Lago after the former president's time in the White House. They're going through a whole bunch of pre-trial issues on that one. The next hearing is late July. It really doesn't look like that one is close to beginning at this point, as it is sort of working through the system here. And then there's that state case in Georgia, the Fulton County election interference case. The next hearing in August is on the former president's appeal regarding the prosecutor in that case, Fani Willis, and whether she should be allowed to continue to prosecute the claims against him. So the timeline is stretching, right? I mean, this is the case that I think people thought, if it came, would be resolved prior to the election, and that's exactly what we're seeing here.
Let's bring in someone who worked for Mr. Trump's White House, former White House Deputy Press Secretary Hogan Gidley. Hogan, thank you for being with us. Give me your initial thoughts.
Well, someone I worked with for a long time, actually, on the first impeachment was a man named Alan Dershowitz, who you know very well. And he said one of the things that he was most concerned about in all of these matters with Donald Trump was the venue. Donald Trump alluded to it in his comments there. You hit on some of them where he pointed out the real verdict is going to be on November 5th. Couldn't get a fair trial here. The venue was a problem. He also said this is far from over. I think that's very poignant from the former president, because he understands just what is at stake here. And I know, Savannah, for example, you used to be a reporter there at Court TV. I think you're even an attorney, as I recall. And for the life of me, I can't imagine any other case where you would allow a defendant to stand trial for a month, but no one would tell you what you were accused of until the last part of the closing arguments. The whole thing on its face, in my opinion, is a complete and total joke. Now, what the left has gotten in this verdict is exactly what they wanted. Yes, they wanted to bleed him dry financially. Yes, they wanted to keep him off the campaign trail. And they wanted to be able to call him a convicted felon. This is purely political, and you're going to see that when Joe Biden himself is going to address this from the White House, elevating this and showing some of the rampant politics around these proceedings.
Well, Hogan, just a point of correction there. Of course, the former president knows very well what the charges are against him. They're laid out in a 34-count indictment. But I think what you're referring to, which is a fair point, is that some of those underlying crimes that are sort of the girding and the foundation of those charges, which are clearly delineated, those were not really delineated until the final hour in closing arguments. So I understand what you're saying. I just want to make sure that we're clear about that.
And how do you mount a defense if you don't know those things? Those are key to the case.
Well, there were aspects of it that came out through the trial. So yes, and by the way, the defense did respond to them in the trial.
Just want to note, as we talk about what is happening politically here, and as Hogan has brought up, for example, President Biden, in just the last minute, he has tweeted from his campaign account that there's only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office: at the ballot box. Now, not specifically referencing the verdict, not specifically referencing the convictions here for the former president, but interesting, Savannah and Lester, both Donald Trump and Joe Biden are saying it all comes down to November. On that, these two agree on that point.
Well, there's no question. And I think there were partisans, people who are obviously not fans of the former president, who were hoping there would be a legal resolution to what they perceive as a political problem. That, in all likelihood, is not going to happen, although we will see whether or not the Judge Marchand sees fit to give him jail time and how that might affect anything. But again, I mean, it's as extraordinary as it is, our Constitution has very few requirements in terms of eligibility to be president. You got to be 35 years old, you have to have lived in this country for 10 years, and you have to be a natural-born citizen. And why? The founders didn't want to put a list of requirements. They wanted the voters to decide. They wanted the voters to say, this is unacceptable for us, for a president, and this is fine. And that is essentially what will happen in this election in November.
What we're seeing, too, from the Biden campaign is this pivot to a degree, or at least a shift towards what a senior campaign official had told me just within the last 72 hours that they had wanted to do. Once this trial ends, remind people that this is in their view, a very stark and clear choice between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And you're seeing that in this statement that is just in now from the Biden-Harris campaign through a spokesperson. It is not from the president or the vice president, saying that today's verdict does not change the fact that the American people face a simple reality. There is still only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office, at the ballot box. It also says that Donald Trump has always, again, from the Biden campaign, mistakenly believed he would never face consequences for breaking the law for his own personal gain. So obviously, the legal issues fold into what the Biden campaign will press as a character case against the former president. And the former president will use his legal issues, not just this one, but the other ones as well, to try to make the case that he is the one who is a victim.
Well, that's what's interesting about what Hogan Gidley said. Fair point. He feels the left and the President Biden are going to use this politically. Perhaps they will, but certainly Donald Trump has used it politically to his advantage, I might add.
He raised $360,000, as far as we can tell, from small donors on day one of this trial alone, Savannah, based on the fundraising appeals. And he's got another one out tonight from the campaign. I'm just going to pull it up briefly here, where he calls himself, or the campaign calls him, a political prisoner. It's him with a raised fist here. I mean, it's begun already.
Let's go to Kelly O'Donnell, NBC senior White House correspondent. Kelly, at the White House right now. We know the president in recent weeks has been a little more willing to take jabs and mock Mr. Trump. We saw the tweet, or the X, if you will. Do we expect the president to make remarks about healing, about the court system, about all the things surrounding this?
In time, that is likely, Lester, but it is just a strange moment of timing that today is the 9th anniversary of the death of Beau Biden, the president's son. He is away in Rehoboth with family, marking that day. And the guidance we have had is there are no immediate plans for the president to speak on this issue. There is an expectation that the White House, in the official role, separate from the campaign, would emphasize the importance of respecting the rule of law. And inevitably, the president will be asked about the verdicts and what this will mean for the election and what it means for the country and the historical perspective in the days ahead. But right now, he is with family at their home in Delaware and focused on the loss they suffered 9 years ago. So the sort of strange twist of history, that was such a pivotal moment, the death of his son, in encouraging him to run for office in 2020. And then on the anniversary of Beau Biden's death, to have a verdict in the New York trials of Donald Trump is just one of those strange coincidences that brings so much of this into focus about the larger context. So we expect that the White House will ultimately support the rule of law, support the jury's verdict. At the moment, it is the campaign that is speaking in terms of how they are responding, and again, pointing to November and the choice that Americans need to make. They have a couple of paragraphs in a statement that Hallie alluded to, talking about how this is a choice for the American people.
Kelly, let us just jump in here for a second, because I want to get outside to the courthouse. Tom Winter is our NBC News producer who was inside the courtroom as that verdict was read, and he joins us now along with our correspondent, Laura Jarrett. Tom, there is nothing like the tension in a courtroom right before a verdict is read. Tell us what it was like in there, whether the jurors looked at the former president, and any other color you can provide from the courtroom.
Sure. Well, it was really a 180 in what occurred in there, because the judge brought us in. First off, the prosecution just showed up. We did not hear the bell. It's a 1960s rotary style bell that we typically hear when the jury has something to tell the court. That's what we've been hearing over the past day or so. The prosecution comes in. All of a sudden, Donald Trump and his team come in, and the judge says, look, it's my intention here to let the jury go at 4:30. And 4:30 comes and goes, and we're about 5 or 6 minutes past that. He comes in. He says, well, we received a note from the jury at 4:20 saying they have reached a verdict, and they want about 30 minutes or so more to be able to go through the paperwork and go count by count and item by item. At that point, the mood in the court completely changed. You could even hear the air conditioning system in there over just a couple of keyboard strokes from reporters that were in the courtroom. Obviously, the tension built. Prior to that, the former president and his defense attorney were talking as if the day was over. They were laughing with each other, covering their mouths down so that the cameras that are viewed in the overflow courtroom weren't seen. And so the focus was just kind of the day is done. And immediately the gravity of the moment struck everybody in the courtroom, prosecution and defense. And you saw a real change at the defense table, understanding that this was really it. To your point, Savannah, I noticed the jurors, and I did not see all of them coming in because of just the way that the courtroom was set up, but I did not see any of them make any eye contact with Donald Trump prior to the verdict being read. I did not see them make any eye contact with the prosecution either. At that point, the judge asked the jury foreperson, have you reached a verdict without telling me? He said yes. He stood. They handed him a handheld mic, which allowed all of us to hear what he was going to say. And then one of the courtroom staff members went count by count. All those 34 counts, which as you well know by now, were all guilty. There was not a ton of reaction within the courtroom. We had been strongly admonished by the court security officers. They didn't want any sort of outbursts of any type. Once the jury was polled, which as you know is the moment where the judge or the court asks each individual juror if what the foreperson read was accurate. They said yes. And then at that point they were let out, and there did not appear to be any sort of significant eye contact there either. And there were some jurors that, of course, over the course of a trial, as you know, are more animated than others. Some take more notes than others. But even those that were a little bit more animated, I didn't detect any sort of kind of a telling of what the verdict would be prior to it being read. So obviously a kind of a quick turn of events, putting all of this in perspective. For years, going back to September 2019, when the Manhattan District Attorney's Office asked for Donald Trump's tax records, asked for his financial documents, the two Supreme Court battles that followed all throughout the pandemic up until the point when they got those documents, at that point there, Savannah, this case kind of moved forward slowly because there was a bit of a change here at the office. There was an election. There was a different district attorney, as you know, that came in and took office. And the plan of attack, if you will, for this investigation and case changed after that point. And eventually we got the charges that we got today, and approximately a year later, well, here we are now talking about a verdict. Where does this go from here has been so often the question involving investigations surrounding Donald Trump for the past 6-7 years or so. Today, this is kind of a big moment because we have no indication whatsoever that there is now going to be any sort of ongoing criminal jeopardy for the former president and presumptive Republican nominee going forward. None from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, no indication that they're doing any additional work, no indication that the federal prosecutors about 2 blocks from me and the FBI 2 blocks from me is doing anything involving any sort of investigation involving the former president as it pertains or has a nexus to New York. Obviously, there's the other cases that you well know about. So it's a big moment today, a bit of a period on a number of investigations going back to the Michael Cohen guilty plea in federal court that surrounded all the conduct in this case. And so now we'll just have to see where those other 2 cases go. But as far as things go from here in his hometown, where so much of these investigations originated from or involved, including the conviction and jailing of his chief financial officer, Alan Weisselberg, and the conviction of his company, it's over.
All right,
so
Tom, on that note, let me ask you.
Obviously, those guilty pleas.
Let me ask you, we're obviously seeing the helicopter shots around the courthouse, presuming the former president has not exited yet, but we know he was required to be in court every day and certainly to be in the courthouse during the deliberations. Is he now free to return to Florida, or is he, does he still have to remain in New York?
100%, Lester. They addressed that at the end of the guilty plea in the proceedings today, or the guilty verdict, I should say, in the proceedings today. The prosecution said that he remains ROR, which is he's released on his own recognizance. There's no bail, there's no restriction, so he's certainly free to travel to Florida at the instance that he wants to, or anywhere else across the country, obviously, as he continues his campaign. So at this point, Lester, there's no restrictions on Trump. The question here going forward, and something that we're going to need to report out and get some clarity on, it was not addressed in court, is whether or not the gag order remains in place. What happens to that? Can Trump start to speak about the jurors? Can he direct his comments and obviously his Truth Social posts more pointedly at the prosecution and the judge and the people surrounding this case? That's a big question, whether or not he kind of goes on the attack. And obviously it was statements that he made that got him in a finding of contempt here, not put in jail pending this trial or during the course course of it. But that's something that is a bit of a question and perhaps a significant one, knowing how much the former president likes to talk about his particular cases, in this case in particular, whether or not he can do that and to what extent he can do that, Lester, going forward.
Tom, what about the jurors now? They're free. They've been dismissed. They've been thanked for their service. I think it was indicated the judge might chit-chat with them behind closed doors to thank them. A lot of times attorneys try to speak to the jurors. They want to learn what worked, what didn't about their cases. But they are free to remain anonymous, or they can identify themselves and do interviews, right? They're not under any further restriction from the court.
Perfectly put, Savannah, and that's exactly what the judge told them. The judge told them, look, you're free at this point to speak if you want to, not if you don't want to. He did want to talk to them afterwards, more of a process thing. He says, look, I can't talk to you about the case. I can't talk to you about how you came to your verdict, but I do want to figure out, were there any sort of issues with the process, things that worked well, things that didn't work well from the point of voir dire, obviously up until the conclusion of testimony and then their ultimate verdict here today. So that's what the judge is going to focus on. The jurors, not to get too much into their security plan for obvious reasons, given the sensitivities of the case and the fact that they are anonymous. There are little details that came out in the course of their questioning that have been well reported at this point, kind of a cross-section of people that you might expect here in New York City. And so really it's up to them. They will be taken to another location. Their security is assured to that point. So it's not a situation as if they're going to come out of the courthouse, say, behind me any minute. That's not what's going to be occurring.
All right. Tom, we want to point out that we've learned that DA Bragg is going to be holding a news conference, making some remarks. We're told about 6:30 Eastern time. So where are we? About 45 minutes now. We will look for that. Also want to point out July 11th is the sentencing date the judge issued a while ago. That is just a few days before the start of the Republican National Convention. So, Hallie, we can only imagine what that's going to be like.
And I think back to the few days before the Republican Convention back in 2016. Donald Trump was just announcing his vice presidential pick, who was then, of course, Mike Pence. And I wonder, how are we going to see this collision between the politics of this? Will the Trump campaign try to do perhaps some counter-programming to that degree right before the Republican convention? We don't know yet. There's still more reporting to be done. But I think the thing that I'll be most interested to see, at least between now and maybe the next month, 6 weeks till that sentencing, is what do people say now that he has been convicted? Does the polling shift? Because right now, yes, we are seeing that some degree of people, even 6% of Trump voters, say they'd be less likely to vote for him if he were convicted. That's not a big number, but remember, this election is not going to be about big numbers. It's going to be the tiniest margins.
That brings me to Hogan Gidley, who is a former aide to Donald Trump in the White House. And Hogan, I'm giving you truth serum on this one because I know that the former president will know how to spin this and know how to talk about it, and we've already seen that. But if you are in your old job and you're on the campaign, how concerned are you really about this conviction going into a tightly contested presidential race?
Well, I would be concerned, Savannah, and by the way, you don't have to give me truth serum. I always bring the truth to you. You don't have to worry about that. But let me give you some truth right now. 67% of Americans already believe these attacks on Donald Trump are politically motivated. 59% of Americans believe Joe Biden is part of it. Okay? That tells me so many in this country aren't really concerned so much about this, although the weaponization of government is a very big issue that Republicans, Donald Trump, will run on. They care about the issues that affect them every single day. And poll numbers shift and change based on information the public gathers. And so, for example, in 2020, they thought that Joe Biden would unite the country. They thought he'd be good for the economy, good for the border, good for the world. No wars would break out. The exact opposite has happened. So you've seen a shift in those poll numbers, which is why Joe Biden is losing to Donald Trump in all the battleground states on all the most important issues. The same thing applies here. We'll see maybe a shift in the days and weeks following this, but as it begins to play out and settle, getting closer and closer to November, Donald Trump's right. This is where we're going to decide the next election will be on Election Day, and it'll be about the issues the American people care about. And when they can't afford gas and groceries, and when they have drugs pouring into their communities, killing our American citizens from Mexican drug cartels, and you have human trafficking and children children being sold into sex slavery, wars breaking out all over the world, crime spiking, and when they do get caught, no one goes to jail. They are rejecting the Joe Biden policies.
Right.
That's what this election is going to be about.
Okay, Hogan, I'm going to wrap you because you're getting into campaign speech territory there. So let's stay focused, stay on the topic here. Let's go to Kristen Gibbons-Fedden, who is also an attorney. You prosecuted the Bill Cosby case. We're now looking at a sentencing date about 6 weeks away. You've got Judge Marchand, who's aware of what Danny Savallo so ably laid out about in the typical case, this probably wouldn't be a case where you get jail time. On the other hand, you have a defendant who has violated the gag order at least 10 times and who did not receive any kind of penalty for that. Do you think any of this is like in the swirl of what Judge Marchand might be considering?
He absolutely would consider it, absolutely. But as Danny pointed out, the most significant considerations and factors that really go into sentencing is whether or not he's committed a crime in the past. And he really hasn't. Yes, he violated the gag order, but certainly if the judge was not willing to change the bail conditions, he's probably not willing to sentence him severely as a result of the gag order. And then the other factors that Danny kind of brought up as well. Look at the severity of the crime. There's a low-level felony, and so it's probably not going to significantly impact the sentence in that regard.
Let's go to Stephen Hayes, an NBC News contributor, CEO of The Dispatch. Stephen, we were just having a colloquy with Hogan Gidley about the political impact. You, of course, are a Republican. I think you're no fan of Donald Trump's. However, how do you think this plays in terms of the election?
Yeah, well, I agree with some of what Hogan said there. I mean, I think the unfortunate thing for the country is this was the weakest of the 4 cases against Donald Trump. It was brought by a political prosecutor who needed to take a circuitous route, sort of double, triple bank shot in order to convict Donald Trump. And I think it was a weak case. Unfortunately, now what you have is a political situation where Donald Trump, if you've been paying attention to what he's been saying in his speeches and his appearances and his Truth Social posts, he has been laying the groundwork for this for a long time. Of course, it wasn't the Biden Justice Department that's responsible for this, but Donald Trump has been actively conflating the cases brought by the Biden Justice Department, the case in Georgia, with this case, and suggesting it's everybody out to get him. The Democrats are out to get him. And unfortunately, I think he has a better case on those grounds in this particular case, in this particular conviction, than he does in other situations.
Stephen, thanks very much. We want to cut back to outside the courthouse. You can see the aerials of lower Manhattan. We believe the former president is on the move now, presumably going to Trump Tower uptown. Laura Jarrett, I think you're able to see this as well.
Yeah, you can see his motorcade making its way through the city, winding its way through lower Manhattan. It's interesting, Lester, outside of court, it is eerily quiet. This had been sort of a chaotic scene in the moments as I was reading the verdict. You could hear a lot of cheers, a lot of boos. It all came very quickly as the 34 counts were coming in, as long as it took to read that. But right now, it is remarkably peaceful. There's obviously swarming with law enforcement that have been gearing up for this moment. Not predicting that he would be found guilty, but prepared for whatever may come, whatever the security risk is. These are law enforcement professionals that have trained for high-profile cases before, but obviously this is different. The stakes are higher. It is politically tinged. It has been sort of a tinderbox in this First Amendment area outside of court, where just weeks ago a man set himself on fire mere steps away from the courthouse. So law enforcement has been ready for this moment, prepared for this moment, whatever the verdict might be, and we continue to watch now the former president of the United States, now convicted of those 34 felonies, working his way through the city now. A different status, not politically perhaps, as you guys have been discussing for the past half an hour, but certainly legally. He is different, in a different category today, now having been convicted of these crimes.
All right, let me turn back to Kristen, if I can, to talk about the impact of this. We've already heard from some of the supporters of the former president. They believe this was a political process. So clearly there is suspicion, a suspicious glare glancing toward the court. But what about, or toward the prosecution, but what about the court itself? Has it suffered?
I hope hope not. I think absolutely, listen, the narrative that a lot of the Trump supporters are going to have is going to be maintained. They're going to say this was politically motivated, it was a witch hunt on the side of the prosecution, but we've already heard some negative comments regarding George Merchan and specifically his daughter and her affiliations with the Democratic Party, whether true or not, and how it impacted the case. And so absolutely they're going to look at the court system, and of course they're going to look at the jurors as well. Trump has made some statements about the jurors early on, before the trial started. So I absolutely think so, but at the end of the day, you know, I think one of the things that's really important here is Trump's attorneys had the opportunity to select the jury. That was part of the judicial system, and that is exactly what played out here. Trump had certain constitutional rights that were abided by and respected, and that's exactly what we saw in this trial. And at the end of the day, I think all of this could objectively agree that Judge Merchan acted appropriately, fairly, and he conscientiously made sure that he applied the law as it was intended to be applied, as precedent had dictated it should be applied.
It's interesting because in that very brief statement we heard from the former president, he took on the issue of venue, saying that this trial should have never been conducted in New York City, in Manhattan, which is a bastion of you know, liberal politics, that most of the jurors would not be Trump supporters was his assumption, and he's still banging on that drum. And speaking of, I think he just posted to Truth Social, Hallie.
He did. It is really reflective of what he said that we showed live outside of court, that this was a disgrace, he said. He continues to reiterate that he believes this is a rigged trial by a conflicted judge, etc. He says we will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over, in his words. Again, an allusion to November. On this, go ahead.
No,
I was on the venue point. I think it's an interesting one because this is an issue that first thing he said when he came out of court, and I'll tell you, there was a lot on the bingo card of what he could have reacted to, what he could have said when he came out of court, and that's what he chose. It is worth noting here that his defense team only challenged one juror out of the 12. That challenge was obviously denied by Judge Merchan here, but it was, as we saw, an intensive and exhaustive voir dire process, too, for jury selection as well. Of course, Manhattan, obviously New York, does lean Democratic. That is the case. That is true.
And if he had gotten a change of venue, it would have still been in the state of New York, because it's a state case. You don't move it to another state.
Danny, how long before typically would an appeal process take for a case like this?
It could take years. I mean, most appeals take it takes several months to even get a briefing schedule. They have to file their notice of appeal relatively quickly. They get an appeal as of right to the appellate division.
What do you say they have to file it right away on the specifics of what they're challenging, or just that they're going to challenge?
Just a general notice of appeal, and that starts the appellate process. Then it's going to be in the appellate division first department, because that is the intermediate appellate court here that serves this county and close by counties. It goes up to the appellate division, and that takes months, sometimes years. It really depends on the congestion in the court. Arguably, you know, in a case like this, maybe it gets a little closer look, maybe it moves along a little faster, but no, we're months, many months, if not years away from a decision.
But during that time, you would be either serving a sentence or some kind of a sentence.
Yes. General rule is this: if you are serving a very short sentence and you have a major issue on appeal that has a likelihood that you can show is going to result in some overturning of your conviction, then you can not suspend it. You can ask the court to hold it while you appeal. Mm-hmm. That is not the norm. That's the exception to the rule. But obviously, if it's a sentence of probation, that doesn't happen. If it's a very short sentence and you have those constitutional issues, you can get them to hold off on your sentence. But typically, if it's a lengthy sentence and it doesn't involve any novel issues, then you're going to serve that sentence. Otherwise, everybody would try to prolong their sentence while they were on appeal, and nobody would actually be in prison.
We're watching the Trump motorcade as it presumably heads uptown to Trump Tower moments after, if you're just tuning in, the former president was found guilty. A sweeping verdict from a jury here in Manhattan, 34 counts of falsification of business records, a felony because the jury found it was in pursuit of promoting an election by unlawful means. And those unlawful means, Danny, are likely the fertilest ground for this appeal because, as we've explained this morning, the jury had to find that there was this unlawful means, but they didn't have to agree on what exactly it was that the former president did wrong. So how do you mount an appeal on that when when they were given an assortment of laws that they could have said that there were violations of, but we don't know which ones they relied on. It's not in the court record. It wasn't on the verdict form.
I expect to challenge that the statute is what's called unconstitutionally vague. Now, it's presumed that we all know the law. It's a legal fiction, but the key is the law must prescribe certain conduct. It must say, thou shalt not do something in a way that members of the public can understand, whether or not they've actually read them, because it's presumed that we've all read the law, which obviously we haven't. But it has to be able to tell us with some certainty what is prohibited and what is permitted. And the argument I believe we'll see on appeal is that this statute is unconstitutionally vague because it does not tell us specifically, what does not tell a defendant like Trump or any defendant what exactly was prohibited. And then also, it may create a burden of proof issue, the statute itself. Again, nothing to do with Justice Merchan, but the actual statute as written may create due process issues, burden of proof issues. All of those are fertile grounds for appeal. And then if you go back to the facts, I guess I would put as number 2, maybe elements of testimony of Stormy Daniels, which at the time Justice Merchan himself said raised some concerns. In fact, the real problem was the defense didn't appear to object when Justice Merchan, it seems, thought they should have.
We're looking at the motorcade right now, and you'll note they've hit some traffic. Unlike a presidential motorcade, which could be 20 or 30 vehicles, this is very short for a former president and dealing with traffic now. Appear to be in the FDR. Makes me wonder if they're going straight to LaGuardia.
Could well be. He may want to get out of town, and he's certainly able to do that as he remains out on bond on his own recognizance. On that appeal issue, Lindsey Graham, who's of course the senator, a Trump ally, and an attorney himself, says he believes this will be reversed on appeal. But just to be clear about that, even if it were, if you win your appeal, you just get another trial. That's if the prosecutors choose to refile charges.
Yes, if your conviction is vacated and the case is remanded back for trial, then yes, a new trial is the next step. But sometimes appellate courts will reverse a conviction and then set the person free. It really depends on what is appealed and what the standard of review is for each ground for appeal.
All right, we want to look what's happening behind the scenes at the courthouse itself. Dasha Burns has been there. Dasha, you were with us as people were crowding in on word that there had been a decision. What's it like now?
Well, Lester, members of the public have been filtering in and out of this park over the last hour or so. People really on all sides of this issue, members of the media as well. We've seen, I think, in fact, over here, some of the folks that are on different sides of this, a supporter of the former president and someone who did believe that he should be found guilty in this case. They've gotten into some clashes, but nothing outrageous. There are police officers here. Some people certainly getting passionate, though, because this is obviously a historic moment. I've been talking to some of the supporters of the former president who really have echoed what we've heard from Hallie and from some of the folks in the studio, that they feel like this is only going to solidify and harden and amplify the support for the former president because they've been listening to what he's been putting out there, what his team has been putting out there. It is a pretty calm scene. I'll tell you, we did hear those cheers and those boos when we first heard the verdict, but otherwise people have been here. They've been discussing this really important moment, a few arguments, some debates, but mostly everyone is just taking in what we have just seen, what we've just experienced, and asking a lot of questions about what exactly is next here. There are more folks having sort of a debate here. This is the First Amendment rights that people are demonstrating right now. They are allowed to be here. They're allowed to make their voices heard. And again, people on all sides of this issue. We've met folks from Long Island, from New Jersey, from the Bronx, from all across the tri-state area that came here to witness all of this, Lester.
And one of the names that has loomed so large in this trial, and Michael Cohen.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about him much here this afternoon. Are we hearing from him? it?
We are, just in the last few minutes here. He, of course, was the prosecution's star witness, somebody who, of course, has lied and has acknowledged lying. The defense, boy, did they target him repeatedly throughout this trial, including in closing arguments, essentially saying to the jury, how can you believe anything that Michael Cohen says? This guy just doesn't tell the truth. Cohen now says today is an important day for accountability and the rule of law. He says, well, it's been a difficult journey for me and my family. The truth always matters. He goes on to thank his attorneys for their advice and support. One of the things that prosecutors tried to do in their questioning of Michael Cohen was try to draw out, it seemed, try to elicit some empathy from the jurors to what Cohen has gone through. He talked a bit about how this process, testifying against the guy who used to be his boss, somebody who he says he was incredibly close to, was his so-called fixer for many years, how this has been incredibly difficult on his family, on him, on his personal life.
They justified some of his anger.
Yeah, they tried to sort of make that case to the jury. The defense obviously tried to poke holes in it, but it is notable that we're hearing from Cohen tonight.
To say he was a fraught witness is an understatement
100%.
because he had lied, admittedly, repeatedly to Congress, to federal court, to prosecutors, to his family, to Donald Trump. He was caught on the stand acknowledging that he had stolen from his former boss. So the prosecutors were trying to rehabilitate him and say, well, yes, he was a liar, but it was always in service of Donald Trump, and now he's here to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Very interesting. By their verdict, Danny, the jury says, we believe you, Michael Cohen.
Yes, and let's take a step back. Yes, Michael Cohen had credibility issues, but prosecutors often use cooperating witnesses, and Michael Cohen was a cooperating type witness, who have much worse credibility issues. Some of these cooperating witnesses are killers. They're people who deal in guns, in drugs. They have lengthy criminal histories, much longer than Michael Cohen. So the reason that prosecutors use people like Michael Cohen, cooperating witness types, is because they work. They are devastatingly effective. I can tell you from having gone up against them myself. And you can point out that they are liars over and over again. But on the whole, a jury is willing to accept someone's faults, someone who comes in and testifies. And the prosecution will usually own it, just as they did in this case. Not only did they own it, they had no problem throughout their case in chief with Michael Cohen being hit with credibility shrapnel throughout. He was painted by their own witnesses as a sometimes tragic, sometimes bumbling figure, but they always owned that he had credibility issues, and they had to do that.
Yeah, and the prosecutors would say, we didn't choose Michael Cohen. We didn't go to the witness store and pick him up for a low, low price. It's Donald Trump who chose Michael Cohen as his lawyer and fixer, and that is his relevance to the case. We have Jen Psaki with us now, of course, former press secretary at the White House for President Biden. So we've talked a lot about what the potential political ramifications are of a conviction, and we are in uncharted territory. So I think, honestly, some humility here, because nobody knows. We've never had a convicted felon as a former president or as a candidate for federal office. But how do you believe the Biden administration, the Biden campaign, will be handling this, and how do you think they should?
Well, you can already see from the last hour or so how they're starting to handle it. And one is the White House had a very short, minimal statement that basically referred to believing in the rule of law. The campaign had a much longer statement. One of the key lines in that campaign statement was about how the only way to ensure Donald Trump is not in the Oval Office is the ballot box, which what that tells you is that they are not relying on this conviction, Trump going to jail, or whatever the sentencing will be, which we won't know for some time either, as the way to get rid of Donald Trump, to prevent him from being in the Oval Office. I think the challenge, if you're in the White House right now, is a couple things. You want to try to control the White House team and staff and people who work there to prevent people from celebrating. This is not a time to celebrate. As you said, this is a very serious moment. This is a jury of the former president's peers who just convicted him of crimes on 34 counts. I mean, this is a serious moment. No cheering, no celebrating. Treat it with the seriousness that it warrants. On the campaign, they also have to manage that. What's tricky is they're going to fundraise off of this.
They already are.
They already are. So they're going to fundraise off of it, but I think it's going to be a balance for them. They're not betting on this as being a factor because, as you said, we don't know. We don't know. We see what polls have said, but polls have even said it's a minimal, it's a very small number of Republicans this could move. But my bet is they're not betting on this. They're betting on the ability to turn the conversation to other things which they want to do.
For the
for the goose and is good for the gander. The Biden campaign's fundraising off it. So is Donald Trump. He's got a post out where he has his image and it says political prisoner.
That's right. It's at least I believe the Democratic campaign arm fundraising off of this at this point.
I think the campaign probably will too. I think we should expect that. And to your point, Trump will as well. Everybody will raise money. That says something about the political system we're in right now, no question.
Well, another point of agreement, which Hallie pointed out, is that both candidates here, Biden and Trump, agree that this gets settled on November 5th, not in any court of law, but at the ballot box by the voters who are watching right now.
Yes, I was just going to say that was the point in the Biden team's statement that actually stuck out to me, right? It is not suggesting it's over. It's saying this is at the ballot box, people. Stay focused. We have a debate coming up. This is not going to change. Don't become complacent in this moment.
And that's exactly what Donald Trump said. The verdict will come on November 5th.
In some ways, it's kind of I don't want to overstate it and say it's a starting gun, but it is certainly a pivot point. We don't know how it's going to pivot, but it is in some ways a reset for these campaigns as they now have this chapter behind them, this hush money trial behind them, and they move forward. To the point that you two are making, we know what the big issues are going to be for this election. At least we know what they are right now. The economy and immigration. The polling has been very consistent on that. Legal issues, so much as they may move a small slice of perhaps independent voters, does not rate, at least not right now, as one of the biggest issues for voters when they're thinking about going to the ballot box come November. The other piece of this, and Savannah, I think it's so important that you talk about a little bit of humility on the part of political pundits, reporters, analysts. We do not know how the polling will shake out or how people will feel now that Donald Trump has been convicted on all these counts. But here is something we do know, that the Republican Party is rallying around him, even in just the last 90 minutes. We have seen an avalanche of statements coming out from Republican lawmakers, from allies of the former president. Interestingly, from people on that Veep stakes list who are immediately calling this, in the words of some of them, a quote-unquote travesty of justice in their view, et cetera.
People who are auditioning to be Trump's VP candidate. He hasn't chosen one yet.
No, and he may not until maybe close to his sentencing date on July 11th here. There's this interesting sort of litmus test moment, too, that has just come up. The former president's campaign leader, campaign manager, Chris LaCivita, is telling one Maryland Senate candidate, Larry Hogan, a never-Trumper who is running on the Republican ticket to try to win a potentially critical Senate seat here, coming out, Larry Hogan saying, we've got to respect the rule of law here. Chris LaCivita says, you just ended your campaign. I mean, the Trump campaign sees this as a way to rally Republicans around them. Now, it is not necessarily Republicans who they need to win come November. That is going to be, I think, the pinch point here for both sides come the fall.
Yeah, let me turn to Hogan Gidley, this idea. How will independents read this?
Well, I mean, it remains to be seen. But as I said, right now, so many, a majority, 68% of independents believe that these attacks are politically motivated. And look, you have to motivate your base to win elections. That is obvious. Donald Trump does that. Joe Biden may be doing that to some degree. But those independents are obviously coveted by campaigns. And how you speak to them and how you talk to them matters. The issues they face every single day, as I was trying to get to in the previous segment, is what I think they will actually ultimately end up voting on, because those are the issues that really impact their daily lives, their children, their own futures, their houses, their car payments, their rent payments. So this is a huge day in politics. Make no mistake about that. And we're going to be talking about it for quite some time, up to and including when the sentencing happens. But the American people are largely going to tune this out and probably have up until this point. They'll pay attention today, maybe tomorrow, but then they're back on to talk about the challenges that they face every single day. And this is the campaign. This is the fight. What can we do on the right to point to all the failures of the Joe Biden campaign and Joe Biden's administration? And what can Joe Biden do to say, look, we don't like Donald Trump, J6, abortion, threat to democracy, et cetera. Those will be the battle lines in this campaign.
What do you think the biggest risk is for Democrats as they figure out how to react to this publicly?
To think that this will end Donald Trump. I mean, the most overused word in the Trump administration time period from the media was the word bombshell, and it seemed to happen every single day. Yes, it's a bombshell today, but really does it impact anything going forward? So if they don't understand the fact that Donald Trump has taken hit after hit before he was president, while he was president, and since he's been president, then they're in for a rude awakening come November.
Well, let me just ask you about that, Hogan, because, I mean, Donald Trump is certainly very happy to talk about the ways he feels he's been victimized. Do you hope, as his former advisor, would you say, okay, you say your piece about this verdict, but then move on? Because people, to your point, want to hear about these pocketbook issues. They want to hear about immigration. They want to hear about economy. They want to hear about reproductive rights. Would that be your advice to your former boss?
Of course, but I don't really have to give it, because you saw him even allude to those challenges the American people face every single day after the verdict. He came out and made points about that. Those are the issues the American people care about. And of course, Donald Trump is going to say this was rigged. Of course, he's going to say it's a weaponized government against him, because we see it, and a majority of the American people believe it, as I pointed to in the polling. But at the end of the day, it's can you pay for your gas and can you pay for your groceries? And right now they can't. Donald Trump, in a unique position, can say, while I was president of the United States, it's not, if you elect me, I promise I'll do this. It's, I was president. Gas was affordable. Interest rates were lower. Inflation lower. Southern border was closed. He can point to victories, and if he can remind people of that and make this election about them, I think he's going to be in really good shape.
Hogan, let's do point counterpoint, because you're here. You've made your case. Jen Psaki is here, who used to make her case at the White House podium in the press room. So what is your answer to that?
I mean, I would say, from a person who's been watching this closely, Trump has given no indication that he wants to talk about all of those issues. We'll see what happens in the coming weeks, but his campaign has essentially been about how he is the victim, right? And he is representing all of the people who are the victims out there. He likes the accolades from that. He likes rallying the base of that. We will see if he talks about the issues that Hogan is talking about. I think for the Biden team, this is an opportunity we have to see if they take advantage of. When the trial is over, what they've had a hard time doing is breaking through. That's incumbent on them to do. But there won't be as much wall-to-wall coverage, because this is a historic moment people should be covering, right? And there will be maybe more space for them to talk about a range of issues that they want to have debates about, whether that is access to abortion and the rights around that, whether that is climate change, whether that is the economy and who's better to fight for the people, working class people. I think they would like to have that moment to break through on that. And I will be interested to see if Trump actually takes advantage of talking about those issues, or if he continues to talk about being the victim of a legal witch hunt.
Worth noting here that even as I think we are, and Hogan flagged this, the Democrats suggesting, some of them, that perhaps this is a death knell for the former president's campaign, that this is a knockout blow. On the other side of the spectrum, you have the former president's son, Eric Trump, saying that May 30th, today, may be remembered as the day that Donald Trump won the 2024 presidential election. And on the other side of the spectrum, we also don't know that yet either, right? So to draw too many conclusions from this at this point does seem like potentially risky.
What's interesting, Hallie, and I know you've memorized all polls and all poll trends, so here we go. But as I recall, after the midterms, Donald Trump was severely politically wounded because of the worse than expected results for Republicans, and Ron DeSantis was on the rise, and we were going into a Republican primary, and it seemed for a moment that Donald Trump's star was falling a bit. And you can look at polls and to the date see that the moment that this indictment came out by the DA here in Manhattan, Alvin Bragg, that Donald Trump's poll numbers started to rise. He vanquished this huge Republican primary field, and many Trump allies will say it's Alvin Bragg's indictment, this one we're talking about today, for which he was found guilty, that was the galvanizing political force.
It's clear when you look at the polling numbers. It's clear when you look at the fundraising numbers, because he got a big boost when these indictments happened. He fundraised off of his mugshot in Georgia, which his campaign is again putting out tonight to try to rally the troops, rally the Republican base around him. Now, some would argue that perhaps Florida Governor Ron DeSantis fumbled the ball a bit on his own campaign, could have been a stronger candidate there, but Donald Trump obviously remained super strong. That was, Savannah, Lester, every show we talked about how strong Donald Trump remained in the polls as time went on. The real X factor, though, remains, and we talked about it then, it helped him in the primary. We just don't know yet how it's going to do.
This is a different set of voters.
Let me bring in Stephen Hayes, NBC News contributor, editor, and CEO of The Dispatch. We just saw the picture of former President Trump walking slowly toward the cameras. Are you worried about, is he worried, is the campaign worried about his image? We're seeing him in a situation here that he's a loser in this court battle.
I don't think they are worried about that. I mean, of course, on a surface level, nobody running a campaign would like their candidate to be a convicted felon. On the other hand, we've seen the Trump campaign sort of lean into this outlaw image and embrace it. If you look again at his rhetoric, Wildwood, New Jersey, the things he's been saying lately, he's sort of owned this and is using it as a way to galvanize the less engaged voters that the Trump campaign thinks are key to victory in in November.
Okay, we're just looking at the picture of the former president's motorcade. They've apparently gone right to the Trump Tower in Midtown Manhattan. We believe that he's now free of the obligation to remain in New York, but at least they're making the stop at Trump Tower.
And he's got many family members with him, especially in these final days of court. We've seen Don Jr. and Eric. We saw Tiffany Trump at closing arguments. Jared and Ivanka, who are, of course, key figures, Ivanka Trump and her husband, Jared Kushner, key political figures and advisors in the first Trump administration, nowhere to be seen. Melania Trump, nowhere to be seen. So it's been interesting. And we've seen also an entourage of not only Trump lawyers, but sitting United States senators and congressmen coming in to fly the flag and support Donald Trump at a criminal trial, which is quite extraordinary. I'm old enough to remember a day when lawmakers wouldn't want to be seen within 500 feet of a politician on criminal trial.
And it was Senator Rick Scott who broke the dam on that. And it wasn't day one of the trial, by the way. It wasn't like the first day.
It was Stormy Daniels' testimony.
Here we're seeing former President Trump now walking toward his residence, and you can hear crowds. Let's listen for a moment. Displaying that fist, that symbol of strength, as he has many times when encountering the cameras during this legal process.
It appears that he approached the cameras on
that's
purpose.
Not the way he goes in.
No, he could have gone in, but he went on purpose.
Very well have seen the picture you're going to see in a lot of newspapers tomorrow morning.
You can bet, as he's as media savvy as he is, that's exactly what he intended to do. He may have even reflected on his moment at the podium after the courthouse, where he looked very serious, very grim, and maybe wanted to have a different picture on the front page of the tabloids and the newspapers tomorrow.
Hey, Tom,
for those who still read them.
Tom Winter, what have you learned about what happens now, certainly between now and July?
Sure, Lester. So there's going to be a pre-sentencing report that'll be done. That's standard for anybody who's convicted of a crime. And basically, they'll focus on his background, who Donald Trump is, any sort of factors that the judge should consider for any potential sentence here. That's done. That's automatic for anybody. And then from there, the judge has a decision to make. And he has a decision to make as to whether or not he believes that the conduct that he witnessed, the testimony that he saw, the evidence that came before his court, and the jury's obvious straight guilty verdict here today, whether or not that ultimately ends up in any sort of potential jail time. It's probably pretty unlikely, Lester, given the fact that Donald Trump has no criminal history. The other investigations, they don't count when it comes into this because he hasn't gone to trial in those other cases. So that doesn't come into play. I think as far as the judge's focus, he needs to look at it. I'll note, being in court for when his CFO was found guilty, Alan Weisselberg, when as part of the trial into the Trump organization. Alan Weisselberg obviously previously pleaded guilty, but the judge did notice certain things about the conduct of Weisselberg. So what does that tell us, Lester? It just tells us the judge is definitely paying attention, based on my experience in the courtroom, of the specific conducts and elements of the crimes that he would have heard. Whether or not that ultimately impacts his decision at sentencing, well, that's something that we're going to have to wait till July, obviously, to find out. There should be a bevy of filings that will occur. They're told to file anything on the record by June 13th. Of course, the appellate process you've well gone over with Danny, but as far as the next steps in the sentencing leading up to that July 11th at 10 a.m. date at the courthouse behind us here, there's just going to be a number of paper filings. We don't expect anything else, with the asterisk on that gag order that we talked about earlier.
All right, Tom, if you can swing your camera over to our correspondent Laura Jarrett, we'll go to her next, but I just want to bring everyone who might be tuning in up to date. 6:15 on the East Coast, 3:15 on the West Coast, and it was about an hour or so away that from now that we had just heard the verdict. 34 counts, 34 verdicts of guilty against the former president, Donald Trump, a resounding victory for the prosecution in this case, Laura. So walk us through the charges briefly, what he was just convicted of, when his sentencing is, and what is the likelihood, the potential penalty, and the likelihood that he would serve any jail time.
Yeah, Savannah, just to catch everyone up here, 34 felony counts. These are counts that are typically misdemeanors. They're a falsification of business records. He was charged with doctoring those business records to cover up another crime. That other crime, prosecutors say, was conspiring to influence the 2016 election. That conspiracy happening all the way back to 2015. They say it was born in the Trump Tower in 2015, a meeting between tabloid boss David Pecker, Michael Cohen, his former fixer, and the former president himself, sitting there talking about burying stories that could have hurt his election chances. That was their hook to try to make what is a documents case, a paper case, 34 pieces of paper, into a felony, which is what the jury was persuaded by. Savannah, they were invoices, they were checks, they were ledger entries, and what they said that the prosecutor said that was false, that the jury found true to be true today, Savannah, were that it wrote in the actual ledger and on the check stubs, it said retainer. That retainer, prosecutors said, was bogus. It was false. It was all a cover to paper over what was really the former president reimbursing Michael Cohen for paying off Stormy Daniels' hush money. The hush money itself, not paid by the former president, not even the crime. If Mr. Trump had paid her himself, that wouldn't be a crime. But instead, he used Michael Cohen as this go-between, and that was the prosecutor's hook for what turned this case into something criminal. Now that we have heard the jury's verdict, he will obviously, as Tom said, be sentenced in the coming weeks. On July 11th at 10 a.m. here in this courthouse, Judge Juan Merchan on the 15th floor will bring everybody back in for sentencing, which will be another first, having the former American president, then even just a couple days away from the RNC convention, sentenced here in that courthouse. He obviously will be able to appeal whatever whatever sentence he's given here. It ranges anywhere from probation up to 4 years in prison, because as we've been discussing all afternoon here, he doesn't have any other criminal history. He hasn't been convicted before. The judge is going to have to take that into account, but it's solely within the judge's discretion, whatever that sentence is, between probation up to 4 years in prison. Savannah.
All right, let's, as we continue to absorb this verdict, turn to veteran prosecutor and trial attorney Paul Henderson, who I believe is with us now. And Paul, you're a former prosecutor, but many legal analysts of all stripes and all political persuasions regarded this case to be the weakest of the 4 criminal cases pending against Donald Trump. It was the first to be filed and the first to be tried, and now we have this guilty verdict. But it was even referred to as at a time as a zombie case, because other prosecutors had looked at these same set of facts and declined to prosecute. Alvin Bragg, the DA here in Manhattan, came in and said, I will prosecute it. Are you surprised not only at the verdict, but how quickly the jury was able to reach a verdict given the complexity of it?
In a word, no. I will say this was a novel approach in terms of how they put this case together, in terms of finding a misdemeanor, but then elevating that misdemeanor into an interpretation that spoke directly to fraudulent association of documents with the campaign that he was running. And even all of the challenges I think you were talking about before, where we had a lot of conversation about what the actual motivation was, and is it improper motivation? And there's challenges to the motivation. Was it political? Was it something that should have been pursued? But I will say what stands out to me is that we went through a fair and transparent process with our criminal justice system. It's not lost on me as I look at this verdict that has come out now. You know, I'm reminded of when I was sitting here with you here at the network looking at the Trayvon Martin case with a very different outcome. It's not lost on me the race disparate implications of verdicts like this. And what really stands out is, separate from the motivations and the antagonistic challenges that came up about the case, are the actual and real consequences from the verdict. You don't get to skip around any of that. You know, I know Donald Trump is challenging all of this right now, and he's saying that the real verdict comes out in November with the election, but there are real consequences just from that verdict. He cannot join the military. Not that he would or could. He cannot get a federal job. I think one of the things that stands out to me is that he can't vote in some states now because of this conviction. He can't own a gun. In states like Virginia, Tennessee, Iowa, and Kentucky, he's banned for life with a felony conviction. In states like Florida, Alabama, Arizona, he won't be able to unless all of his fines, fees, and penalties are paid. And we haven't talked about the fine, fees, and penalties, but they're going to be substantial in a case like this. I know there is jail time associated with up to 4 years for every felony conviction, and that's not likely. But the fines, fees, and penalties associated with what's going to come from this verdict are real and will have actual repercussions for Donald Trump personally. I think that's a real way to approach looking at what the consequences are going to be. That pre-sentencing report that's going to come out is going to be very telling in terms of what independent, objective agencies with parole are looking at in terms of the influence for the judges as he makes his sentencing. I'm looking forward to those arguments specifically from prosecutors about what they're asking for in the sentencing because of this conviction. And I will say, just to reiterate it, those consequences are real and absolute. Now, we all got here how we got here through a jury trial that Donald Trump and his representatives were able to participate in. And this is the actual consequence that Donald Trump has been found guilty. In spite of the appeal that I know is coming, there are some real consequences that I think we're going to see leading up to, as I had predicted in the past, that's going to overshadow his own campaign. And we're seeing that happen right now with the sentencing taking place right before the Republican convention. This is going to be at the forefront of the conversations. And that's before we have the consequence and the implications for the other cases that are still pending against the former president.
Yeah, okay, Paul, you raised some good points. And it's important, Danny, as I turn to you, the other lawyer we have with us, to set this in the context of justice. You know, I remember covering a verdict once where the judge told the jurors after the verdict, justice is done when the system works. Paul is saying the system worked. The system was fair. Clearly, Donald Trump takes a different view of that. But I think about being able to find 12 jurors who said they could be fair and impartial. Nobody can say they didn't work hard or take their duties seriously. None of them called out sick. We never had to use any of the alternates. And you just have to reflect on a moment of what we ask our fellow citizens to do when we ask them to sit in judgment of another human being, let alone a high-profile case like this.
It is one of the most important duties as a citizen, and you'll hear lawyers actually say that in their openings and their closing, because it is. It is one of the few purely democratic processes that we participate in, where 12 strangers come together and get unanimous on a particular subject, or sometimes they don't. But they also promise to set aside their biases and judge the facts fairly. Otherwise, they don't make it onto the jury. And getting onto that jury is a commitment. It's a commitment that citizens make. It is probably the highest duty that a citizen in the United States has.
We have a few more minutes before we turn to nightly news. Lester's preparing across the studio here from me, but a word on the political consequences. And again, I guess the order of the day is humility about what we don't know. This has never happened before.
How do you poll on something this unprecedented? Pollsters are trying to do that, obviously, and we do have some signals from, obviously, the fact that these legal issues have been in the headlines for over a year now, at least for this particular case, that there are some slice of the electorate that says that they would be less likely to vote for the former president if he were convicted on this case. We know that about 60% of Americans polled do believe that the charges here, the ones he's just been convicted on, are serious. So there are some tea leaves you could read, but the bottom line is this, and I don't mean to sound like a broken record, it is, think about your own life. It is different when somebody asks you about a hypothetical versus when somebody asks you about something that has actually happened. So I do think it's going to take some time to see the impact. Now, I will say we are already seeing, at least in the short term, an impact on the Republican side of the ledger. You've got a source telling one of our colleagues, Matt Dixon, from the Trump campaign, that their website's actually having problems because they say, the Trump campaign, so many people are trying to get on to donate to the former president right now as he is making these appeals.
Well, we will continue to watch the political ramifications as they play out. Both candidates for office, President Biden and former President Trump, agreeing this afternoon that the verdict is Election Day, November 5th. On that point, they agree. I want to turn to Laura. We have about a minute for you, Laura. If you could just put this case in the context of all of the cases, because there are 4 criminal cases pending against the former president. One has now been concluded, and we await sentencing on that. But the other 3 are not likely to reach the trial stage before Election Day.
Savannah, you're so right. This is likely the only one that will be completed before the November election. The others have been bogged down in appeals and delays. Perhaps the most gravest one of all, the one about the former president trying to overturn the last election, still up on appeal before the U.S. Supreme Court. We've been waiting on that one for the better part of a month now. Still no word on when it will come down. But of course, we also have one in Georgia about also trying to subvert the election. We also have the one in Florida about stealing classified documents, hoarding classified documents after he was no longer the White House. He's pled not guilty on all of those. He said they're politically motivated. He said this has been a political prosecution, but today a jury disagreed, Savannah.
All right, Laura, thank you for your coverage. To all of our panel here. Top of the news, former President Donald Trump, current candidate for the Republican nomination for President of the United States. Donald Trump has been convicted of 34 felony counts. He will be sentenced on July 1st. That concludes this NBC News special report. We have much more on our streaming network, NBC News Now. You can also join Tom Yamas tonight for a special verdict wrap-up at 9 o'clock Eastern. Lester Holt has much more straight ahead nightly news. Begins in just a few moments. I'm Savannah Guthrie. This has been an NBC News special report.
Good afternoon. We're beginning 9 News at 4, half hour late because of the breaking news this afternoon. We are going to continue to cover the breaking news. A historic guilty verdict against former President Donald Trump in his hush money trial.